Hello, and welcome to the next episode of Store's podcast on disaster recovery and business continuity for hospitality. Today's date is January 21st, 2021, and today's topic is what happens during a typical disaster recovery. My name is Dasha, and I'm joining from St. Petersburg, Russia. And with me is data expert Charles Goetz in the Dominican Republic and CEO Andrew Schmidt in the USA.
Thank you, Dasha. What I wanted to discuss today was a set the expectations and review what typical customers experience during a recovery. And those can be a fast recovery. Let's say it's due to a malware incident where a server has to be recovered very quickly, or file and folder restorations, which should be, it's the same process, but it's much less urgent. The steps involved with the or to do the restoration first involve authentication, and then selecting the restoration points. Now, because we're using the Datto systems, the restoration points are all images, and those images are views of the entire computer. So it's everything that we need to reconstruct that machine. And what's nice is that you can select an image and then start it up as a virtual machine on the Datto local appliance. So that virtual machine can boot up very quickly, and you can also start several at the same time. Let's say you didn't know when the malware incident affected your server. You could start 2 or 3 different restoration points and choose the one that you want to actually do the full recovery on. The steps involved, Charlie, why don't you talk about what you've seen and what the customer should expect?
Thanks, Andrew. Well, when your server is down because of a threat, a hardware issue, or any other issue, the first step to take is to start the local virtualization, just as Andrew mentioned, from the Datto appliance, in order to get the server up and running within minutes. Starting a local virtualization is the scenario where the Datto appliance is in a different VLAN than the other servers. It is necessary to allow the appliance to have communication to the specific VLAN of the server that failed, so the virtual machine can be bridged to the correct network in order to be able to assign a new IP address of the production machine, so the device can continue working without any interruption.
When the virtual machines come up, you assign network information to them, so they'll boot up in a sandbox, so they're isolated, and then you connect to that virtual machine through a remote desktop protocol right on the Datto. So you'll RDP into the virtual machine and then configure the networking information.
Correct.
The VLANs, you have the ability to support multiple bridged LANs on one network interface, or if your local appliance has multiple Ethernet ports, you can bring up the secondary port on different VLANs. And we've those kinds of issues, the networking issues, which I think turn out to be the real the problems that we face. Those are the things that need to be thought through that are outside the scope of the recovery on the Datto device. Those networking issues really aren't within scope of what we're dealing with, but definitely affect the restoration. So once the VM's up and running, what happens next? So you've got a VM. Let's say you assign it to the network. That machine now stands in as the production server?
Yes, it does.
And then how long will it's a system or a property typically run on those virtualized machines?
On a normal basis, it will take only 1 hour.
So it's about an hour to bring up the system. Well, the VMs can come up very quickly, and it's about an hour for the total recovery when the networking, all those issues are resolved on average, what you've seen. And then how long do you think the properties will run on those virtual machines?
For the virtual machines, it depends on the client. But in every scenario, every property will take about between 10 and 20 minutes until the client could ensure us that they are able to resolve the problem with the physical server without being in a hurry.
Right. Yeah. So having the virtual machine running, it decompresses the entire hardware or the restoration problem, and then you can resolve. So if it's a malware incident, the actual hardware should not be affected and would be safe to roll back to once you've identified a good restoration point. In the case of if the hardware were to fail, you can run on the data machine. I think for POS or PMS, mission critical servers, it's like a day or so before people will switch those from the data back to the perform BMR.
Yes.
On average.
On bigger critical machines, the average is 1 to 2 days.
Okay. And then that process now. So the next step, you got the virtual machine up and running. It's also running production backup, so it's identical to the machine that's failed for all intents and purposes. It'll run at it's running on a different CPU, so it will be at a different speed. In some cases, it might be faster if the data machine is newer than the failed hardware. But so the next step would be then to do the bare metal restoration back to the some hardware.
Correct.
So why don't you talk a little bit about that process, how that works?
Well, Andrew, just as you mentioned, as soon as the virtual machine is up and running, the next step is to perform the virtual machine restore. It's a simple process that will only transit in 3 or 4 steps. The first step is basically to download the ISO of the Data Utilities application that we're going to use to boot up the device. The second step would be to image the USB drive with the Data Utilities application. This application includes the bare metal restore, rapid rollback, series image, and red cloud restore environments.
Now that the VM's up and running, it's taking production backups. Those production backups can be used for the bare metal recovery, and the BMR process is just booting up the target machine into the data recovery environment. You download that ISO from data.com, and authenticating with your local appliance and selecting the last good backup. Now I would suggest running one more quick one off the production server, grabbing that one and doing the BMR, and then it's just a matter of physics, right? You're waiting for the LAN. You're governed by your LAN speed. And what have you seen there, Charlie? What are those recovery times like across the LAN for like a big POS or big PMS server?
For a normal basis, Andrew, that will only take about 20 to 30 minutes for those types of machines. But as you mentioned, it will only depends on the networking speed of those servers.
Well, that's not too bad. So under half an hour. So definitely you can set the expectation that the thing can be wrapped up in an hour, or your mileage is going to vary, and the worst case would be a big file print server. But yeah, I think under an hour seems pretty reasonable. And then when that thing reboots, the last step is to write the boot sectors with the native environment back to the Windows environment. So it'll reboot as the Windows server, just as it was from that last good backup on from the VM, and it's ready to go. Charlie, do you have any advice on what end users can do to make this process smoothly?
Yeah, Andrew. Actually, I would recommend 3 things to take in account. First of all, have your USB drive ready. Secondly, I would recommend knowing your network. And third of all, I will simply recommend to all customers to run a verification test every 2 or 3 months just for your audit.
So download the just download the image. Burning it with Rufus to the USB is going to save you 5 minutes, and hours of time could be saved in debugging network configurations during a time of disaster. And those would be noticed during an audit if you were to run through the process. At a minimum every year, but I would think during every 6-month audit would be great. Okay, I think that wraps it up. Dasha, if you have anything else to say, I think we're done here. Thanks for your time.
Okay, gentlemen, I'd like to thank you for joining me. Thanks for sharing your advice and opinion. Great discussion. I believe we covered many points that are connected with typical disaster recovery. Please join us next time as we try to bring you information about cybersecurity. Go to hexistore.com for more information, and you can also subscribe to our Twitter account. Thank you for joining us today, saying goodbye and wishing you stay protected.